5 days. That is how long this war has been burning. 5 days since the first American bombs tore open the sky above Tehran. 5 days since the supreme leader was killed and the world's largest oil choke point went dark. 5 days since the United States of America crossed a threshold that no president before had ever crossed, and that no amount of press briefings or carefully worded statements from the West Wing can uncross. When this began, the official language coming out of Washington described a precise, targeted, time-limited operation. 5 days later, that language has been quietly retired. Nobody is saying targeted anymore. Nobody is saying time-limited. And the word operation has been replaced in briefing room after briefing room with a word that carries an entirely different weight. The word is campaign. My name is Ann Applebum. And what I am going to tell you in the next several minutes is not analysis, not opinion, and not a projection about what might happen if conditions deteriorate. It is what is already happening right now, this morning, as documented by Reuters, the Associated Press, the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon, Al Jazeera, and the foreign ministries of at least 9 nations that went to sleep on Friday as observers and woke up on Wednesday as stakeholders. These are 5 new signs, 5 concrete, documented, undeniable developments from the past 48 hours that the 30-second notification on your phone is not giving you the context to understand. Because context is the difference between watching a fire and understanding that the building is fully engulfed. And right now, the building is fully engulfed. Sign number 1, Iran has just crossed the nuclear threshold in the most significant public way since the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, and the world's most powerful monitoring body has lost all visibility inside Iran's most sensitive sites. On Tuesday, March 4th, 2026, the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that all remaining IAEA inspectors have been expelled from Iranian nuclear facilities and that real-time monitoring systems at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan have gone completely dark. Not degraded, not partially interrupted, dark. The IAEA Director General issued a statement describing this as the most serious loss of nuclear oversight the agency has experienced in its 60-year history. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization simultaneously announced the suspension of all voluntary cooperation with the agency, effective immediately, citing what it called the illegitimate military aggression of the United States against the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic. Here is what that sentence actually means when you strip the diplomatic language away. The country with the 3rd largest uranium enrichment capacity in the world, which was already sitting on 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity before this war began, has now severed all international monitoring, expelled every foreign inspector, and shut off every camera. No one outside of Tehran knows what is happening inside those facilities right now. Not the IAEA, not the CIA, not the British intelligence services, not the Israeli military, no one. Weapons-grade uranium enrichment requires 90% purity. Iran's stockpile was already at 60%. The technical gap between 60% and weapons-grade is not measured in years. It is measured in weeks, under the right conditions, in a facility that no longer has any international eyes inside it. Paul Ingram of the University of Cambridge's Center for the Study of Existential Risk told reporters on Tuesday that the combination of a leadership vacuum in Tehran, an ongoing shooting war, and complete international blindness inside Iranian nuclear facilities represents a scenario that arms control experts have feared for 2 decades and never expected to see materialize all at the same time. All at the same time. That is where we are on day 5. And any person in any government anywhere in the world who tells you they know with certainty what is happening inside Natanz or Fordow right now is lying to you. Sign number 2, the war just acquired a new geography, and a country that shares a border with both Iran and a NATO member just became the most dangerous piece of territory on earth. Turkey. When this conflict began, Turkey occupied an awkward diplomatic position, a NATO ally that had cultivated its own relationship with Tehran, a country that has historically tried to play both sides of the regional divide. That awkward position ended on Tuesday night. Turkey's foreign ministry issued a formal declaration that it would not allow its airspace or territory to be used for military operations against Iran. Simultaneously, Turkish President Erdogan announced an emergency meeting of Turkey's National Security Council. And within hours of that announcement, three things happened in rapid succession that should alarm every person who understands how alliance systems work. First, the Turkish parliament voted to put its armed forces on heightened alert. Second, Turkish state media reported that Erdogan had held direct phone calls with both Vladimir Putin and Iran's acting leadership council. Third, a senior Turkish government official told Reuters on background that Turkey is actively considering invoking Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which requires the alliance to consult when any member believes its security is threatened. Read that last sentence very carefully. Turkey, a NATO member state, is considering invoking a clause within the NATO treaty not because it was attacked by Iran, but because it feels its security is threatened by the actions of its own NATO allies. That is not a normal diplomatic sequence. That is an alliance fracture. If Turkey formally invokes Article 4, every NATO member government is legally and constitutionally obligated to convene. And what happens inside that room when European governments that never wanted this war find themselves seated at a table with the United States government that started it is a conversation that has no clean or comfortable resolution. The alliance that has held the Western security order together since 1949 will be asked formally to answer a question it has never had to answer before. Was this war worth it? Sign number 3. The global economy just received a shock that economists are already comparing to 1973, and the comparison is not flattering. On Wednesday morning, March 5th, 2026, oil prices broke through $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. Brent crude opened at $101.40. West Texas Intermediate followed within the hour. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed, with the United States Navy and Iranian forces in a state of active confrontation across the waterway. Lloyd's of London has now suspended war risk coverage for all vessels transiting the Persian Gulf, which in practical terms means that most commercial shipping companies cannot get insurance to send their tankers through that corridor at any price. When Lloyd's of London walks away, everyone else walks away. The Saudi Ras Tanura refinery, struck by Iranian drones on Monday, remains offline. Saudi Aramco issued a statement saying damage assessment is ongoing and that restoration of full capacity has no confirmed timeline. The 13 countries of OPEC plus Russia held an emergency call on Tuesday and declined to announce any increase in production, with the Saudi energy minister citing security conditions that make any production commitment impossible to guarantee. Goldman Sachs published a research note on Wednesday morning projecting that if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for 30 days or more, Brent crude will reach between $130 and $150 a barrel. Here is what that means for you specifically, not for traders in Geneva or energy ministers in Abu Dhabi, but for you, sitting where you are watching this. A barrel of oil at $130 means gasoline prices at or above what Americans paid during the worst of the 2022 energy crisis. It means airline ticket prices climbing 30 to 50% within weeks. It means the cost of fertilizer, which is manufactured from natural gas derivatives, rises sharply, which means food prices at the grocery store follow within months. It means that every economy in the developing world that imports its energy, which is most of them, is now staring down an inflation shock that their central banks have no clean tool to address. The war in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It never has. It shows up in your electric bill, in your rent, in the price of a loaf of bread. Every credible financial institution that has issued a note in the last 48 hours is pointing in exactly that direction. Sign number 4, China just made a move that has no precedent in the modern era, and the United States government has not yet publicly acknowledged what it actually means. On Tuesday, March 4th, 2026, 3 Chinese naval vessels, including one Type 055 guided missile destroyer, entered the Persian Gulf. China's Ministry of National Defense described the movement as a routine freedom of navigation exercise and a mission to protect Chinese citizens and commercial interests in the region. The Pentagon responded with a statement calling the deployment concerning and saying it was being monitored closely. Here is what neither statement tells you. China imports approximately 40% of its oil from Persian Gulf producers. China has $1.4 trillion in trade exposure to economies across the Middle East. And China has watched for 5 days as the United States military conducted offensive combat operations in a region that China considers vital to its own national security and economic survival, without asking Beijing's permission, without notifying Beijing in advance, and without offering Beijing any mechanism for input into how this ends. The deployment of Chinese naval forces into the Persian Gulf is not a freedom of navigation exercise. It is a message. And the message is that China is not a passive spectator in a conflict that directly threatens its energy supply, its economic relationships, and its broader strategic argument that American unilateralism is the defining threat to global stability in the 21st century. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, and Rand Corporation analysts all warned in the days before this conflict that a U.S. strike on Iran risked triggering exactly this kind of Chinese strategic response. Now, those 3 Chinese warships are in the water, and every naval strategist in Washington, London, and Tokyo is working through the same scenario analysis. What happens if an American vessel and a Chinese vessel find themselves in the same 10-mile stretch of the Persian Gulf at a moment of active Iranian-American confrontation? There is no protocol for that answer. There is no hotline set up. There is no agreed de-escalation ladder. There is just the Persian Gulf getting more crowded by the hour. Sign number 5, President Trump's own timeline for this war has extended publicly for the second time in 5 days, and the language coming from his administration no longer matches the language that was used to justify launching it. On the first day of strikes, the administration described a focused, defined operation targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure and command leadership. On day 3, the president said publicly the operation would last 4 weeks or less. On Wednesday, March 5th, the Secretary of Defense appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee and was asked directly whether 4 weeks was still a realistic planning horizon. His answer, which was reported by the New York Times, Reuters, and C-SPAN's full broadcast of the hearing, was that the timeline would be determined by conditions on the ground. Conditions on the ground. That is the phrase that every American who lived through Iraq, who lived through Afghanistan, who lived through Vietnam has heard before. Conditions on the ground is the phrase that military commanders use when they can no longer defend the original timeline, but are not yet prepared to replace it with an honest one. 3 American service members are already dead. U.S. aircraft are down over Kuwait. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait City has been in emergency security posture for 5 consecutive days. Hezbollah is firing rockets into northern Israel for a 5th night. Lebanon's health ministry reports civilian casualties in Beirut mounting past 200. Iran has fired ballistic missiles at American air bases in Bahrain and Qatar. 6 Gulf states have been struck by Iranian weapons. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Oil is above $100. And the replacement supreme leader of Iran, expected to be announced within 48 hours, according to Al Jazeera and CNN, is widely projected to be a hardliner with less institutional resistance to escalation than the man who was killed 5 days ago. None of this is contained. None of this is time limited. And none of this reflects the operation that was sold to the American public, the American Congress, and the American military families who are now waiting for news. So where does all of this leave us this morning on day 5 of a war that was supposed to be defined in days? The honest answer is this. The IAEA has lost all visibility inside Iranian nuclear facilities for the first time in 60 years. Turkey, a NATO member, is threatening to fracture the alliance from the inside. Oil has broken $100, and analysts at Goldman Sachs are projecting $130 or higher. China has deployed warships into the Persian Gulf in a direct strategic signal to Washington, and the administration's own timeline for how long this lasts has already been walked back twice without any public accounting for why. None of these facts are from anonymous sources. None of them are interpretation. All of them were reported in the past 48 hours by the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon Briefing Room, and the United States Senate Armed Services Committee hearing that was broadcast in full on national television. The question that every serious analyst is now asking is not whether this war has a defined endpoint. It does not appear to. The question is whether there is still a diplomatic architecture capable of creating one. Right now, that architecture is under more simultaneous stress than at any point since the Cold War. Iran has expelled international monitors. Turkey is convening its Security Council. China is in the water. Russia is at the United Nations. And the families of 3 dead American soldiers are in the early stages of a grief that no official statement will ever make adequate or just. Pay attention. Tell people what you know. Share this with someone who has not been following closely, because what is happening in the next 72 hours will determine whether what already happened becomes a chapter in a history book or whether it becomes the opening paragraph of something far longer and far worse. The window is not yet closed, but windows do not stay open in a war zone, and the only force capable of keeping it open is a public that demands accountability before that window shuts, not after.